Rings, Swords, and Monsters, Lecture 10. Imitations and Reactions. Brooks and Donaldson.
The success of The Lord of the Rings and the figure of its author, who fans even call the Professor when they raise a glass to his memory on January 3rd each year, has cast a very, very long shadow over all the fantasy literature written since the 1960s. And I say the 1960s because even though The Lord of the Rings was published in 1954 and enjoyed very solid sales, it didn't become the worldwide phenomenon that it is today until the 1960s, with a bunch of very complicated stuff about pirated paperback editions and so forth that we can leave out. But in general, every writer that's come along since then has to deal with Tolkien somehow. Even if they don't believe that he invented the fantasy genre, they know how important he is, and they know how important he is to the other readers that they want to pick up. So, how do these various writers deal with the fantasy genre? Well, we have what the critic Harold Bloom calls an anxiety of influence. Now, Bloom does this, I have to say, in the Figures of the Romantic Poets, and he's got a whole bunch of kind of Freudian material in there about how they have to kill the father in order to be, and we're not going to go that far. A better way, I think, of reading the anxiety of influence is to suggest that writers, on the one hand, want to be parts of traditions. They want to see themselves as being in the tradition of other writers who have come before them. But on the other hand, they want to be recognized for their own individuality. They don't want to simply be rewriting the same fantasy story over and over again. And this is certainly the problem that writers have when they deal with Tolkien. There is an enormous amount of what you could call derivative Tolkienian fantasy that came out since that time. A great deal of that fantasy may have been generated by the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game phenomenon that really gets started in the 1970s and is very big in the 1980s. And Dungeons & Dragons had a very complex relationship with Tolkien. I think it's worth talking about for a second before we move into books. The Tolkien estate would not allow Gary Gygax and the Dungeons & Dragons people to specifically use things from Tolkien. They had copyrighted character names, they had copyrighted races of creatures, and so forth. On the other hand, you couldn't really do fantasy without Tolkien. And so the Dungeons & Dragons people managed to invent most of Tolkien's stuff with different names. So they found that they could use the word halfling, but they couldn't use the word hobbit, but they could give them the same characteristics as the hobbits. And instead of wizard, they often used magic user, though I don't know if that's a copyright issue or just they wanted to try something different, make a wizard be a certain level of magic user. They couldn't have a Balrog, so they have a big fiery demon called a Balrog demon. And you can see how this would play out. You take the Tolkien idea, and you either find its source in some medieval literature and draw it from there, or you change it just slightly enough that the Tolkien estate can't sue you for copyright infringement. Now, what that whole relationship did, whether it was intentional or not, was to genericize, if that's a word I'm allowed to use here, to make generic a whole bunch of Tolkienian ideas and material, whether it's Dark Lords in towers or Balrogs or hobbits or rangers, whatever you want to call them, they became generic. They were no longer just Gandalf. There was some kind of generic wizard or magic user. Gandalf's a bad example because there's always been wizards. But there wasn't just Frodo. There were these generic halflings. They could have their own characters and so forth. This also happens in literature. And this is where you get the flood of what we could call derivative fantasy. And by derivative fantasy, I'll even name some names, even though it's mean, and even though I've enjoyed some of these derivative fantasies. The biggest of these, who we're actually going to talk about in some depth, is Terry Brooks, whose 1977 The Sword of Shannara kind of opened the gates for the flood of derivative fantasy. There's a great many more. You could say David Eddings' Belgariad books, or any variety of kind of sword and sorcery, damsels in distress, monsters and dragons books that have come along. I would include even the very contemporary Aragon books as being very derivative. You have a kind of standard characters and standard problems, and you have to work with this. I would not, by the way, include J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter in the derivative fantasy, because even though it borrows a lot from traditional fantasy, is its own thing also. And we'll talk about that very briefly later on when we get to Tolkien's inheritors. So let me go back now to Terry Brooks and The Sword of Shannara, which people in the Mythopoeic Society and real aficionados of fantasy literature often call The Sword of Shannara to indicate how much they hate the book. Now, I don't hate The Sword of Shannara, and I remember reading it as a 9 or 10-year-old when it came out in the 70s and enjoying it very much because here was something that was at least recognizably Tolkienian. I mean, yes, you can read The Lord of the Rings over and over again, and I've read The Lord of the Rings probably at least 40 times in my life, which is a little bit scary. But nevertheless, you want to read other things as well, not just reread the same books. And so The Sword of Shannara kind of allowed you to do both. It allowed you to reread The Lord of the Rings because it was such a slavish imitation of The Lord of the Rings, and yet it was a different book. But let's look at some of the similarities. There are pseudo-hobbits. In this case, they're called Valemen. They're not physically tiny, but they're also not big and brawny, and that's Shay and his brother Flick Omsford. So there's Frodo and Sam for you. Frodo and Sam aren't brothers, but it's very close to the same relationship. There's a wizard, Alanan. There are 2 heroic men, like Boromir and Aragorn. In the company, you have Balinor and Menyon Lay. There's a gruff dwarf named Hendel, instead of Gimli, and 2 elf brothers named Durin and Dale. Okay, so here we have twin elf brothers instead of the one elf, but they're pretty similar. It's strange that the one elf is called Durin, since that's the king of the dwarves in Tolkien, but you can see the borrowing already going on, perhaps even subconsciously. There's an evil dark lord named the Warlock Lord, and there are evil black-cloaked minions who seem to be able to fly called Skullbearers, so they're the matchup for the Ringwraiths. The gimmick in the story, though, is quite different from that in The Lord of the Rings. Instead of going to throw away a ring, which I still will assert, and many critics have noticed this before, that most quest narratives are about finding a treasure, finding the Holy Grail, finding the great sword, defeating the monster. The Lord of the Rings is about throwing a treasure away, and Frodo himself says that. Bilbo went to find a treasure, I go to throw one away. Well, Terry Brooks doesn't copy that far. Instead, there is a magical sword, the aforementioned Sword of Shannara. The sword is the only weapon that can defeat the Warlock Lord, who's otherwise invulnerable to human beings. And the gimmick, which we don't find out till the end, is actually a pretty good one. The gimmick is that the sword forces whoever touches it to face the truth about him or herself, the absolute unvarnished truth. We can set aside for a second the huge philosophical problem of what that actually means. But basically, if you touch the Sword of Shannara, if you either hold it to wield it or have it poked into you, like happens to the Warlock Lord, you have to see where you stand in the great scheme of things. Now, if you're a basically decent person like Shay Omsford, you can survive that truth. You can feel the criticism that's brought about by it, about how you're not as brave as you'd like to be or as honest as you'd like to be, but you can basically survive. But if you're a hideously evil being, the truth hurts. And the truth hurts a lot. And eventually the Warlock Lord dissolves himself because he can't stand the truth about himself. It's a great gimmick, and I would tie it back a little bit to when we talked about Gollum on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. Remember, Sam says to Gollum, "Are you the hero or the villain in this story?" And Gollum isn't there. And one of the real problems raised by that idea is Gollum the hero in his own mind? Or is he so broken that he can't be? Well, Brooks is engaging with that idea, saying, for someone who's really done truly evil things, the truth would be unbearable. And I think that's a really interesting idea, because our kind of current modern relativistic notions of truth might suggest that the evil person, the Adolf Hitler or Mao Zedong or Saddam Hussein, confronted with the truth about himself, would say, well, it's what I had to do in order for a greater good. Brooks is suggesting if you touch the Sword of Shannara to those people, they would commit suicide or explode or something because they couldn't stand to admit the horrors that they had actually unleashed. So it's a very interesting idea, and it connects with this idea of fantasy, that fantasy suggests that there is an outside, objective, true moral truth that you can get to, or you can at least aspire to, rather than that all truth and all morality is relative. I think that's important because in pretty much all, maybe not all, but pretty much all modernistic literature, truth is relative. I mean, that's one of the big points of it. That's one of the big points of Faulkner's The Bear or Absalom, two of one of the greatest short stories and one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, is that people perceive the truth in such different ways that it's really impossible to untangle which is the real truth and which is just Quentin Compson's truth or which is just anyone else's truth. And fantasy literature strongly resists that relativistic idea. There is a truth, and we can get to it. And even something as derivative as Terry Brooks suggests that there is a real truth. Now, even the plot of The Sword of Shannara is really quite derivative. There's the multiracial quest group, which was so important in Dungeons & Dragons because it became fun that each different person playing the game could have a different racial or professional identity. You could be a halfling or an elf or a dwarf, or you could be a magic user or a cleric or a thief. That idea obviously comes from the Fellowship, where the 9 walkers, Gandalf and company, each have their own different talents that they contribute. Well, it's the same thing for Dungeons & Dragons, and it's the same thing for Terry Brooks, somewhat the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and many, many, many other books that have this fellowship that goes off alone. There's also the idea of the large geopolitical concerns going on, the great wars generated by the Warlock Lord, simultaneously with the individual quest, and even to the point where Shay, the real hero, the Frodo figure, gets separated from everyone else, even separated from the Sam figure, in this case, and goes off alone, though he finds some companions on the way, and so forth. There's a battle in the Druid Citadel in which the wizard seems to be lost, and then he comes back, just like Gandalf with the Balrog. And then later on, there's a travel through what are essentially the Mines of Moria, though this time called the Tombs of the Kings. But in this case, the wizard isn't lost at the end. It's Shay, the Frodo character, who gets swept away from everyone else. But I will say that once Terry Brooks wrote all the Tolkien out of his system, he was able to write subsequent books that were more original and in some ways more interesting than the Sword of Shannara. Now, this list of sequels has gone on and on and on. It's still going on today. The last time I checked, there were 14 books that were in some ways sequels, prequels, side stories, and so forth to the Sword of Shannara. There's been a very successful franchise for Terry Brooks, though there's never been a movie, which is interesting. But Brooks's later books, and I'll particularly single out the Elfstones of Shannara here, became much more original. In the Elfstones, his big gimmick is that there had been these horrible demons that had been exiled from the world, and the only way that they're kept out is by this magical tree called the Elcris. And the gimmick is that every certain number of years, the Elcris dies, and a beautiful, innocent elf maiden has to become the tree. So there's that sacrificial idea, individual sacrifice, except in this case, it's not just that you have to have your finger bitten off by Gollum, but you really have to sacrifice yourself. There's a little love story, and though it gets really tedious after a while, there's real resistance by the main character in the Elfstones to using the magical Elfstones. He doesn't like using them. He feels that they're changing or hurting something in him. And it's this resistance to using the magic that Tolkien doesn't really have in there. The characters who have magic use it. The characters who don't. That really sets the stage for what's coming up next, which is the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. But in both cases, the resistance to using the magic makes the main characters much more modernistic heroes, makes them more reluctant, and makes them a little bit less scary than Aragorn would be if he were brought into our real world. I want to go over this idea a little bit more because it's so well brought out by the movies of The Lord of the Rings, and also because I talked about it briefly beforehand. What you see in the evolution of the hero, if you want to take it from Beowulf through Tolkien's depictions in The Lord of the Rings, through the film version of The Lord of the Rings, and then even more pronounced in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which we'll get to in a moment, you'll see that Beowulf as a hero has no doubts. He has no existential doubts. Well, maybe I shouldn't be a hero. Maybe it's not a good idea. It's basically, I'll fight the monster or I'll die. And that's it. When the dragon comes and burns down Beowulf's castle, he has a moment of dark thoughts when he wonders if God is punishing him because of something. But then he says, nah, and goes off and fights the dragon anyway. That's a medieval hero. Gawain and the Green Knight, same way. Most of the Arthurian heroes, same way. They don't question whether they should be a hero or not. They question whether they're going to win or not. Then we come to Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. And although Aragorn has this laser-like focus on winning the war and thus becoming king, he's also willing to die, to not become king, to get killed when they all go off to Mordor to distract Sauron, as long as the world can be saved. That makes him much more of a modernist hero, much more of a 20th century hero. And why? Because the hero who has no doubts is really scary to us after the events of the 20th century. At least this is what I would stipulate. That before that point, especially in the medieval time period, the only question was, how do you have a good person be the one who has the power? After the 20th century, we start to believe that having the power makes a good person turn bad. Tolkien's trying to finesse this with Aragorn. Aragorn never doubts that he deserves the power, never doubts that he should be king. But he's really focused around the idea of service. He goes off in the wilderness and he hunts for Gollum and he protects the Shire for actually decades and decades. Aragorn is way older than he looks. In fact, he dies at the age of 256, and he doesn't look a day over 100. In fact, he's in his 80s during the events of The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn represents a different kind of hero than the medieval hero, but even Aragorn was really not acceptable to a movie audience and to a late 20th century audience. And so when the actor Viggo Mortensen enacts the role of Aragorn, you see him not with that laser-like focus on becoming king and winning the war, but with the kind of doubts that a standard not even an anti-hero, but a reluctant hero would have. Aragorn wonders, my ancestor Isildur, he gave into the ring. Maybe I would give into the ring. Maybe I shouldn't be king. Maybe I shouldn't even do things here. And that kind of tortured approach makes him far more palatable to us. Because I think in our current society and culture, if we saw someone who said, oh yes, I definitely should be the leader of everyone, and I have no doubts that I'd be a great leader, we would run away from that person because we have the example of people who sought that kind of power throughout the history of the 20th century. But this whole view of the hero, whether it was a sacrificial hero like Frodo or a kingly hero like Aragorn, really, really bothered quite a number of writers who came along. Some of those writers disagreed with Tolkien very strongly on political grounds, and some disagree with him on aesthetic grounds. And Stephen R. Donaldson, who's going to be the subject of most of the rest of this lecture, disagreed on both. Donaldson wanted to have a much more traditional, I would say traditional in the modernist sense, not traditional in the medieval or fantasy sense. He wanted an anti-hero, not just a reluctant hero, but an anti-hero, someone that you would expect to see coming out of a Hemingway book or any other Norman Mailer or someone like that as a 20th century writer. And so he comes up with a great, great gimmick, and that is his hero, Thomas Covenant, is a modern leper. And I mean that exactly as it sounds. He is a modern man with a happy life with a wife and a child who comes down with an unexplained case of leprosy. Now, Donaldson knew a lot about this because his father was a doctor who took care of people with leprosy, and he knew how the disease worked, and he researched it and so forth. And as many, many, many people learned in the 1980s when they read the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, what leprosy does is it destroys nerves, and so a person's hands and body becomes numb, they can't feel pain, they can't feel other things as well. So, Thomas Covenant is a leper. He loses his wife, takes the child, and leaves because she can't bear to have the child be around his leprosy. And he himself has to develop an entirely new consciousness about how he's going to run his life. Lepers have to constantly survey their own bodies. It's VSE, visual surveillance of extremities, to make sure they haven't cut or injured themselves all the time. This is actually true about how contemporary people who contract leprosy and who it's not treated quickly enough, how they have to deal with the disease. And what Donaldson does, which is very different from both Tolkien and Terry Brooks, but similar to C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, which we're going to talk about in the children's literature, is he doesn't make a complete secondary world. He makes a secondary world that's tangent to the primary world. And so his characters go from the primary world to the secondary world and back. In Lewis, that's the children go through the wardrobe and to Narnia. In Terry Brooks, Thomas Covenant keeps being brought into the land with a capital L. That's the secondary world that he's able to enter into. But unlike the kids in Narnia, and unlike just about every other hero in fantasy literature, Covenant refuses to believe that the secondary world is real. He calls himself Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, even after he's convinced himself that actually it's not a dream, maybe it's not even a hallucination. He says, I can't believe in it, because when I leave it, I'll go crazy. Because in the land, he no longer has his leprosy. He's been cured. And he says this is not the kind of fantasy that a leper can afford to have. Now, this is wildly frustrating for the readers of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant because we just want to sink into the land. We want to enjoy the land. And in fact, except for Tolkien, I can't think of a secondary world that's as beautifully realized as Stephen Donaldson's The Land. Perhaps Ursula Le Guin's secondary world in Earthsea, but the land has something special, a special vitality to it. And this is done very deliberately by Donaldson to contrast with Covenant's own numbness and sickness that he has back in the real world. The land is bursting with life. Everything is alive in a special way. Stones have a special life to them that can be manipulated and controlled by people who have learned how to do this. Wood has magical powers. The good guys in the land are called the lords, and they have dedicated themselves to understanding how the earth power in the land works. And Covenant eventually falls in with them, and they're thrilled to see him because he is the reincarnation of an ancient hero. Beric Halfhand. Covenant's had 2 fingers amputated because of his leprosy. Beric had had 2 fingers cut off. Covenant also bears a magical ring. We're like, uh-oh, here's the Tolkienian part. But it's white gold rather than pure gold. And this fits in very much with Donaldson's theme. It's not perfectly pure gold. It's an alloy. It's something that's impure. And that idea of an alloy, of a mixture of white gold or a mixture of health and illness, which is what Covenant is at the center of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Donaldson is dealing with themes of healing. Tolkien is dealing with themes of fallen perfection. But when Tolkien describes in the land of Lothlorien, there was no illness in the land of Lothlorien, that land had left no stain, it really leaves out a kind of a character who might be sick and even contaminated the way that Covenant sees himself. By having leprosy, he views himself as contaminated. It actually gets worse. Not only does Covenant refuse to be the savior of the land, saying, I won't wield the white gold, I don't know how to wield the white gold, but he does some pretty horrible things when he gets there. One of his first acts in the land is to rape someone because he's driven insane by the feeling that's come back to his body. And this young girl actually is at least somewhat attracted to him, but then he rapes her. So the whole entry into the land begins with a crime against someone. And that crime comes back again and again to haunt Covenant through all the books, what he has done, how he has wronged this young woman. So you'd be hard put to come up with a character less like Frodo than Thomas Covenant. On the other hand, what Donaldson has done as he borrows and develops these Tolkienian themes. For example, there's a giant. The giants are wonderful. We love the giants. Saltheart Foamfollower. And Saltheart Foamfollower is very, very much like Treebeard in The Lord of the Rings. He talks very slowly and sonorously, and he has great power, and he loves Thomas Covenant the way Treebeard seems to love Merry and Pippin. So there's similarities like that. There's a great actress called Revelstone that's very similar to Minas Tirith. There's even, at the end, a giant volcano in which the climactic action, or a big important part of the climactic action, takes place. So, yes, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant are exceptionally derivative. I would say that the second series, there's 2 sets of 3 books, and the second one comes back thousands of years after the first, and Donaldson invents this amazingly cool idea called the sunbane, a curse that's been put on the sun, so that each different sun there's a sun of fertility where everything grows really fast, and then the sun might change color, and there's a sun of rain where it just floods the whole land, and there's a sun of corruption where everything rots in like 3 days. It's a really neat idea, and it's very well developed, and there's yet another quest to remake the Staff of Law, which Covenant broke at one point, to restore law and healing to the land. Now, all of this is centered around the conflict with the evil Dark Lord of the land, who's called Lord Foul the Despiser. And Lord Foul, like every other Dark Lord, seeks domination and destruction. But more importantly, he seeks to be set free from the land. This is like Lucifer, who's fallen from heaven onto earth, wants to break out of earth and get back into the universe. And he can do that if he gets Covenant's ring. So that's like Sauron. He wants to get a hold of the ring. But Lord Foul also says, I will make your life so miserable, Thomas Covenant, that you will give me the ring. I will continue to torture you and to make everything you touch be destroyed until you give me the ring. And so there's this interesting play, and you know, of course, that in the end, Covenant's going to meet Foul, but I won't say how that plays out, and it takes 6 books in some ways for the whole thing to be resolved. There is a resolution after the first 3 books. But what Donaldson was trying to do, in some ways, with Lord Foul, though there are problems with Lord Foul, with this idea of corruption, of infection, that's entered into bodies and can't be purified, is that he's reacting against Tolkien's notions of purity. If you think about how Tolkien created Galadriel, she's pure and tall and a glass filled with light, and she gives Frodo the phial of Galadriel with pure light coming out of it. If you think when Frodo is injured and they remove the splinter from his shoulder and Gandalf thinks he may become like a glass filled with clear light for those to see. These images of purity are beautiful, but they're also exclusive. And anyone who's been tainted or destroyed in some way can't really fit in. What Donaldson adds then is this idea of healing and how someone who's imperfect, even wildly imperfect like Thomas Covenant, could in the end do something very wonderful and powerful for the land. Now, this is not to say there aren't some flaws in Donaldson's work. Just as in Tolkien, there's a series of journeys in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. In the first book, for example, after Covenant has traveled through the beauty of the land and seen everything that he's supposed to see and gets to Revelstone and meets the Lords, then they go off on a journey across the land through the Landsdrop. There's like a plateau on one side and you have to go down a large cliff and into the lands to the east. Likewise, in the second book, there's a variety of journeys and there's a battle and so forth. This time they go to the west, and Covenant actually meets up with his own daughter because the time passes differently. The daughter who's the product of the rape that he had done in the first book. And they have a very interesting relationship because she absolutely adores him, even after what he's done. And this is actually one of Covenant's problems and a very interesting take on it by Donaldson, because everybody adores Covenant except a few people who really hate and despise him, who have good reasons for that because of all the horrible things he's done and the fact that he's refused to help the land willingly and so forth. So there's the idea of various journeys going on while there's a huge battle going on. And there's also characters who brought in from the primary world, a character named Hyle Troy, a blind man who's a military genius who is helping the armies of the Lords fight off the evil armies of Lord Fowl. There's kind of a secondarily evil creature, Drool Rockworm, who's a cave wight who has discovered the Staff of Law and is misusing it, and also some large thing called a bane called the Ill Earth Stone, which causes him to be able to mutate things and make horrible things happen, and Lord Fowl gets a hold of that Ill Earth Stone eventually. The three books, by the way, I should have said, are called Lord Fowl's Bane, The Ill Earth War, and The Power That Preserves. In each case, the books have a much more of a close and a climax than the three books of The Lord of the Rings, which again were meant to be one large book. Each of these books closes up fairly nicely, but in each of them, Covenant does something good, something to save the land temporarily, but still refuses, is always refusing. It's about his unbelief. I think that's very important to understand what Donaldson is doing and how it really is a great reaction against Tolkien. Tolkien saying the secondary world is about creating belief in the secondary world. And Donaldson, in a very kind of metafictional view, says it's about creating belief in the secondary world in which the character in the secondary world doesn't actually believe in the secondary world. And he plays a lot with that idea. He also works with some of the ideas that Tolkien was developing in The Return of the King about pride and despair. If you remember, Tolkien is very harsh to Denethor, who gives up, who commits what in medieval times would be called the sin of wanhope. This is the sin of sloth, which we think of as being lazy. But in the Middle Ages, the sin of sloth really meant to give up on the idea that you could be saved, to say that I've done so many bad things I could never turn it around, and so I give up. That's the sin of wan hope or pale hope. That's Denethor's sin, as well as the sin of pride. Well, obviously, that's Thomas Covenant's sin also. But Donaldson says that's not a sin. That's a survival mechanism. That's what you have to do if, for whatever reason, and it is never explained in any of the books, why Covenant got leprosy. It just happened. Just came out of the sky like a bolt and destroyed his life. And yet he has to go on. And his kind of toughness, his insistence of doing his visual survey of extremities, his VSE, which he does even in the midst of the land, even when there's nobody around and so forth, even when he's no longer a leper, is really important to see that that's how he's maintaining his own integrity against the fantasy of the land. In that sense, and I'm not sure Donaldson intended this, but in that sense, the whole Chronicles of Thomas Covenant question the idea of a complete fantasy and suggest that a complete fantasy like that might be very dangerous to someone who entered into it. It's a direct critique of escape. Although readers escape by reading the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, Covenant himself refuses to escape into the land, as beautiful and powerful as it is. Now, that's not to say there aren't any flaws. There are quite a number of flaws in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Some of them come, I think, from Donaldson not being edited closely enough. And this has been a problem from Terry Brooks on. Fantasy is going to be successful, and the writers of fantasy don't seem to have the editing pressure. Tolkien put that upon himself by revising the works over 17 years, and there's still flaws in The Lord of the Rings. For example, the annoying talking fox in Chapter 3, which drives me bananas because I don't understand why there's a talking fox. It doesn't make any sense. But I digress. The biggest flaw in Donaldson is a flaw in style, and this may seem funny coming from someone who defends Tolkien, since so many critics have disliked Tolkien's style. I've argued that Tolkien's style is very precisely what he wants it to be, whether the critics like it or not, whereas I think that Donaldson's style just gets a little bit out of control. Donaldson writes by thesaurus. He uses words the way Humpty Dumpty does in Alice in Wonderland, in that words mean whatever he says they mean, regardless of what a dictionary or anyone else might say. This is a polar opposite to Tolkien, who's very clear that even when he uses an unusual word, the much criticized word eot, for example, when he says they came to an eot in the river, critics are like, why is he saying eot? Well, eot has a very technical term. It's an island that sometimes is submerged, and so on. Tolkien uses the precise technical term. Donaldson just uses things that sound good to him. I'm not being too harsh on that. For example, Donaldson's orc-like creatures, or goblin-like creatures, whatever you want, which is an interesting name and works fairly well, but the Erviles are always called Roinish. Roinish is an obsolete French term meaning ruinous. It's not clear how it can apply to a creature of any sort except by some kind of strange metaphor, and it's certainly a word nobody uses anymore, but Donaldson applies it hundreds and hundreds of times. Anytime there's an Ervile, it's a Roinish Ervile. Likewise, nobody ever sings a lament or a song, it's got to be a threnody, and nobody looks out a window, it's an Oriel, and so forth. So it's a very good vocabulary builder, but in terms of a unity of effect that Tolkien creates, it doesn't work very well. I would also add that there's many critics who don't like Tolkien's kind of cutesy rhyming poetry that he has throughout The Lord of the Rings, but to compare Tolkien's poetry, which is at least the kind of poetry that those characters themselves might have sang, to Donaldson's unbearable free verse poetry. It's apples and oranges, and it's rotten oranges in the case of Donaldson. I mean, his poetry is really dreadful. He's taking the poetic idea from Tolkien, but then trying to write modern free verse poetry that doesn't work at all. When character calls out, Lord, covenant, help and weal, battle aid against the foe, you're like, could someone actually ever call this out in the midst of a battle? It's very distracting. Finally, to me, the biggest flaw in Donaldson, I don't mean to bash Donaldson because I think he's worth reading. He shows how you can try to react against Tolkien and how you can try to write your own story without being in the shadow, though he ends up, of course, like I said, with the volcano, the Dark Lord, the whole 9 yards. But the biggest flaw is that Donaldson's secondary world isn't linguistically unified, and it doesn't hang together the way that Middle-earth does for Tolkien. Without the background of the invented languages, without all the place names being Elvish words that mean something so that you can connect up Mordor and Morgai and Moria and so forth, you end up with a mess in Donaldson where his terminology flails wildly from Celtic, Kevin Landwaster is one of the old lords, to Slavic. There's someone named Lorik who has a krill, which is some kind of a sword, to Semitic, where he has the evil ravers, which are his ring-wraith figures called Samadhi and Sheol and so forth. And there's no real logic behind how you have a character named Kevin who's descended of Beric, who's descended of Lorik. It's just whatever name sounded good to Donaldson at the time. I think this lack of consistency weakens the effect that readers get out of the secondary world, though I will again say the land is incredibly beautiful, and Donaldson's ideas about people who have specifically trained so that they can bring forth heat from stone or shape stones like clay to make vessels or make wood grow in the way that they want it to is very, very beautiful and very powerful. I should also add that Tolkien, I think, recognized the problems in his own secondary world about healing and the marring of the world, even though he didn't address them at all in The Lord of the Rings. There's a late Tolkienian text called the Athrobeth, Finrod Andreth, which is the conversation of Athrobeth and Finrod. Finrod is an elf, Athrobeth is an old woman. And in this and some other texts, Tolkien explained that the way Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, messed up the world was he basically broke off pieces of himself, like a glacier calving off icebergs. Because Tolkien believed that evil could not create things, but you have to have some kind of animating power in your orcs and your dragons and your monsters. These are all little bits of the Dark Lord's spirit that have now been spread throughout the earth, so that you can kill off the Dark Lord, or you can exile him from the world, but there's still lots of little bits of him throughout the world, and you can't get rid of all those bits, and thus the world is marred, and can only be healed, Tolkien thought, by the creator of the world actually entering into it. This is his idea about the incarnation. Now that doesn't show up in The Lord of the Rings, and I think Donaldson would explicitly reject it. Donaldson is not trying to come up with a Christian view. Instead, He's suggesting the way that healing can come through sacrifice and through the removal of evil things, but that people still have to pay a very, very high price for it, and an individual price, which is what happens with Thomas Covenant. So what happened after the success of Tolkien opened the doors to mass market fantasy is that people like Brooks and Donaldson, so with the Sword of Shannara and with the Thomas Covenant books, they expanded the types of characters and the situations that fantasy literature could handle. They labored in the shadow of Tolkien, and they didn't quite meet him or match him in aesthetic terms. And they fought against the anxiety of influence very strongly, trying to set off on their own paths. Even if they had imitated him to begin with, they, by the end of their writings, by the last book, or in Brooks's case, the books still keep going on, they had found some way to write their own stories after they'd gotten the Tolkien out of their system. In the next lecture, we're going to look at writers who managed to escape Tolkien's shadow, who, as much as they might have had anxiety of influence about him, managed to create their own fully realized secondary worlds that aren't a gloss on Tolkien, or a calque on Tolkien, or an imitation or reaction to Tolkien. And those two writers, Ursula Le Guin and Robert Holdstock, are, in my opinion, the greatest living writers of fantasy at this particular time.
After listening to Lecture 10, a student posed this question to Professor Drought. Does Donaldson ever acknowledge his parallels with Tolkien? Let's listen to the professor's response.
Donaldson denies that his works have anything to do with Tolkien, but I don't think anyone's actually confronted him with the very specific parallels and even the volcano in the middle of the world. I think that's a real key also to tell if something's derivative or not. Is there a volcano? If there's a volcano, it's derivative of Tolkien. There really aren't that many volcanoes in the primary world that they have to be represented in the secondary world. And Donaldson has argued, I think, that the important thing to look at in Thomas Covenant is how different his hero is from the Tolkienian hero. But nevertheless, it's still there and it's still influential.
This ends Lecture 10. Remember to visit this course's website at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures that you just heard. If you borrowed this course from a public library and would like your own copy of the course guide for future reference, call Recorded Books at 1-800-636-3399 and we'll send you a free copy. A shipping charge will apply. Rings, Swords, and Monsters, Lecture 11. Worthy Inheritors. Le Guin and Holdstock.
A real question for many writers who followed Tolkien was how to escape Tolkien's shadow. And I think two writers have really done that. And they've done it right off the bat with their fantasy. They didn't write a Tolkienian fantasy and then finally write something original. And those writers are Ursula Le Guin, an American writer, and Robert Holdstock, British writer. They are, I think, of the few authors who could be considered Tolkien's worthy heirs and may even have surpassed him in some ways, though perhaps not in others. Le Guin and Holdstock created fantasy that lives up to the aesthetic standards set by Tolkien without the close imitation that Brooks and Donaldson did. Le Guin and Holdstock also deal with really major Tolkienian issues. In Le Guin's case, with language, and in Holdstock's case, the traditions of the British Isles. And both of them deal with immortality and death, all major Tolkienian themes, but they have very different takes on them. And they're not doing it, again, as simply a reaction against Tolkien. It really feels like, when you read Le Guin and Holdstock, that they're working off on their own. So let's examine these two writers and see how they have surpassed Tolkien, or at least carved out a niche for themselves that's significantly different, but as aesthetically accomplished, or close to being aesthetically accomplished, as Tolkien was. Ursula Le Guin is the daughter of Arthur Kroeber, who was the second person in America to receive a doctorate in anthropology. He was a major, major anthropologist who did a lot of work on Native American culture. And Le Guin grew up in a household where people from Native American tribes would come to visit and where other anthropologists and very important scientists came through. This has shaped Le Guin's sensibility in her writing. You could argue, and I think you can make a very good case for the fact, that Le Guin writes as an anthropologist. That is, as Tolkien was a philologist of imaginary languages, Le Guin is an anthropologist of imaginary civilizations. And her work has a kind of depth and richness that sometimes is even missing from Tolkien, because she thinks about the kinds of customs and the kinds of small-scale technology and the things that people would really do in a real culture in a way that non-anthropologists generally don't think of. Now, Le Guin herself has said that she has been confined to the fantasy science fiction ghetto. And it's hard to argue that, since most of her greatest successes are in fantasy and science fiction. However, I would point out that Le Guin has stories in various anthologies of mainstream literature. She's been noted in Best American Short Stories, which is a pretty good flag of mainstream critical respect. And in fact, even people who hate fantasy or don't respect fantasy, if they feel the need to acknowledge someone, they acknowledge Ursula Le Guin. And they say, well, why can't all the fantasy writers be as good as Ursula Le Guin? Part of this is because Ursula Le Guin's sentence-level writing is not particularly archaic or weird or distinctive. It's distinctive in how effective it is, and I'm going to quote some passages to show you how it works. But it doesn't seem old. She's not trying to write something that looks like it might have been translated from an old book. She's writing a new modern book. Her books are very clearly novels rather than translations of the Red Book of Westmarch or something like that. She also approaches her invented civilizations and languages not in a way where she lays everything out in front of you in the vast size of Tolkien's prefaces and appendices and so forth, but simply through telling the stories of individual people, and different tales creep into the background there. In that sense, it's a lot more like the way an oral tradition would work. Tolkien did this too, with hints and references, but Le Guin does it by having someone tell a little snatch of whatever particular tale is relevant at that case. Only later on, very, very late after she'd written her great Earthsea books, does she come up with a description of Earthsea where she goes through and explains the histories and the backgrounds of things that she's mentioned elsewhere. Most of what I'm going to focus on for this lecture is Le Guin's Earthsea books. Now, these really could go into the next lecture on children's literature also, but I want to discuss them here for two reasons. The first is that although the first three books are in the children's genre, though I would argue the third one gets fairly adult at the end, the subsequent two books are much more adult. They're not appropriate for children, really, and they deal with very adult themes. And Le Guin just allowed the series to grow up the same way that The Hobbit grew up into The Lord of the Rings. And so in that sense, I would put them in adult rather than children's fantasy. More importantly, I think, even though what I think is her most personally loved and admired book, in other words, that what she is most proud of, is Always Coming Home, I'll talk about that in a second. The Earthsea books are her great triumph. They're her best work. In her book, Always Coming Home, the one I think she is most proud of, she develops exactly the kind of wide-ranging backcloths that Tolkien develops in the Silmarillion. She invents a culture, the Kesh, sort of a Native American people, but they're living in Northern California in the far future rather than in the past. They have a Native American sensibility, and they, like, for example, they have names like the names of animals or birds and so forth. And she invents poetry, oral tradition, cosmology, art. There's pictures and drawings in the book as well. Actual music with notes and so forth. The kind of thing that Tolkien said he wanted to do for The Lord of the Rings, and the kind of thing that Tolkien fans have come along and done to try to flesh in all that background civilization. But Always Coming Home is a really, really difficult book. I don't think a lot of critics have read it the way they should, and it's very hard to move through it because it's kind of like the Silmarillion in that it's not easily mediated, even though there are some characters that we can get behind, and it's just very, very difficult. And I think that it hasn't had the effect on other writers that her Earthsea books have. So we're going to focus on Earthsea. We'll also focus on Earthsea because it's really conventional fantasy, whereas Is Always Coming Home science fiction. It's set in the future, but it's very much kind of fantasy terms, or it's just maybe just description of a culture that doesn't exist. So we'll focus on Earthsea, which is very much conventional fantasy in that it has magic and dragons and all the things that we expect. The Earthsea books are A Wizard of Earthsea, The Tombs of Atuan, and The Farthest Shore. And those were written in the very late 60s, early 70s. And then there was a very long interregnum where Le Guin didn't write anything about Earthsea. And then at the very beginning of the 90s, she published Tahanu, which she unfortunately titled The Last Book of Earthsea. Then, 10 years later, around 2000, she published The Other Wind, the real last book of Earthsea, apparently, though I don't know if we should take her word at that either, though she'd have a better ending in it than she did in Tahanu. So that's how this series has developed. And then there's also been some short stories that she's published in the Earthsea world that have focused around it. Earthsea is an island archipelago, hence the name Earthsea. It's a series of islands that people travel to by boat all the time. There's no main continent. There's one very large island in the center. And the big thing about Earthsea is that magic really works. But it's not just kind of generic magic. It's a very specific magic that plays off of language. In Earthsea, there's something called the Old Speech, which is the language that dragons use and which wizards can find out. And if you know the name of something in the Old Speech, you can control it. So in a sense, the name and the thing become one. This is a really important idea that we'll get to in a moment. Just to set up what's going on, Earthsea begins with Ged, young man growing up as a goat herder on the island of Gaunt, but who has born into him enormous power and equally enormous ambition and pride. Ged's wizarding power is discovered, and he eventually goes off to study magic at the School for Wizards on Roke Island. The School for Wizards, yes, it might be a predecessor of Harry Potter's Hogwarts, but more importantly, it's just a beautiful, beautiful idea. You see young apprentices, all male by the way, and Le Guin came up with this on her own and then regretted it later on, running around making glowing balls appear or turning fish into birds or having springs spring up from the ground for no reason, using the mage wind to control boats and so forth. There's all kinds of different levels of magic, but they're all based on the Old Speech. Now, to explain how the Old Speech really works and the structure of the books that follow, I need to make a little digression into contemporary linguistics, or at least the theory of linguistics. Ferdinand de Saussure, kind of one of the founders of linguistics back in the early 20th century, came up with the idea that language can be broken down into what he called signs, okay? And each sign has two parts, which he called a signifier and a signified. And already you see we have the same problem that we have with Saruman and Sauron. We have similar things that both begin with S, and it's confusing. But let me see if I can tease this out so it makes sense to you. The signifier is the actual word, in other words, the noises you make with your mouth, or the scratches you put on the piece of paper, or a drawing you make. And the signified, the thing which is signified, is the thing that you're talking about. And the sign is the combination of the noise you make and the thing, the idea or representation you're trying to communicate. So you have to think about this relationship. Now, Saussure asserted that the relationship between the signifier and the signified was entirely arbitrary. In other words, you could make up any noise you want to represent the concept of tree. And in fact, if you start to look at languages, right, for tree, you can have Old English bam, you can have Spanish arbol, you can have Japanese ki, and so forth. There's all different words. They don't seem to have anything to do with each other, and they all mean sort of the same thing. That's signifier and signified relationship. The arbitrariness of that relationship is the heart of modern theoretical linguistics. And I should add that I think that Tolkien rejected that idea. And there are other writers who've come along who've rejected that idea, that think there should be some close relationship between the sound and the thing. And that's how you create beauty in language, when there's a match between the sound and the thing. Okay, in the Old Speech, the sound and the thing are the same. If you say tolk, which is the Old Speech word for rock, and you have magical powers, you can make a rock appear in your hand. And every person in Earthsea has a secret name that only some people know, a true name. And if you have that person's name, you can actually bring the person to you. You can summon them. You can turn yourself, by changing your own name, into a falcon or a dolphin or some other creature. These are the great powers of summoning and change for Le Guin. Now, why is this important? Because it's a very interesting view of language. This is language before the Tower of Babel, when there was only one language, and when sounds related to things. And language then becomes a technology where words can change things. Now, I would assert that this is actually a very Western idea. Le Guin wants to say that she's a congenital unchristian and all her ideas are Buddhist and Taoist. But actually, the idea that words can change things comes very clearly from medieval Christianity, with the idea that when a priest says, "This is my body, this is my blood," in the Catholic Church, the wine and the bread actually changes in what it is. It changes into real blood and real body. And I think that this figure of wizards is part of Le Guin's tradition, whether she was looking back to it or not. That's the tradition. Wizards are very closely related to medieval priests. They can change things with their words. Look at the other characteristics that Le Guin's wizards has. They're celibate. They live in all-male groups. They learn an esoteric language that they have to... I mean, there's a very close connection. So Le Guin says, oh, no, they're Buddhist, they're Taoist. Maybe later on they are, but they come out of her Western cultural tradition. And she would probably tell me I'm wrong. That's okay. So what Le Guin's first 3 books in Earthsea do is work out the problems associated with this idea if the word equals the thing. Because think about the problems that are generated if the word equals the thing. You can say something and it comes to you. There's problems of control, but there's also problems of identity. In the first book, The Wizard of Earthsea, which follows our protagonist Ged, when he goes to the school for wizards, is very proud, but he doesn't know as much as other people, but he has so much power, and he eventually works himself up into summoning a spirit from the dead. And when he does this, part of the world rips apart, and an evil shadow creature leaps out from the land of the dead and attacks him. And this shadow, and it's a terrifying scene, by the way, beautifully written scene, but terrifying, that shadow is let loose in the world. In fact, let me just read a little bit of that scene so you can see, first of all, how Le Guin writes. Ged has been convinced that he's going to summon the spirit of a woman, Elfaran, who's from an ancient tale. So he's trying to bring her back from the dead so that they can see her spirit. The other boys stood watching, not speaking, not moving, unless they shivered a little, for the great spell was beginning to work. Ged's voice was soft still, but changed with a deep singing in it, and the words he spoke were not known to them. He fell silent. Suddenly the wind rose roaring in the grass. Ged dropped to his knees and called out aloud. Then he fell forward as if to embrace the earth with his outstretched arms. And when he rose, he held something dark in his straining hands and arms, something so heavy that he shook with effort getting to his feet. The hot wind whined in the black tossing grasses on the hill. If the stars shone now, none saw them. The words of the enchantment hissed and mumbled on Ged's lips, and then he cried out aloud and clearly, Elfaran! Again he cried the name, Elfaran. The shapeless mass of darkness he had lifted split apart. It sundered, and a pale spindle of light gleamed between his open arms, a faint oval reaching from the ground up to the height of his raised hands. In the oval of light for a moment there moved a form, a human shape, a tall woman looking back over her shoulder. Her face was beautiful and sorrowful and full of fear. Only for a moment did the spirit glimmer there. Then the sallow oval between Ged's arms grew bright. It widened and spread, a rent in the darkness of the earth and night, a ripping open of the fabric of the world. Through it blazed a terrible brightness, and through that bright misshapen breach clambered something like a clot of black shadow. Quick and hideous, it leaped straight out at Ged's face. Now, I'll point out some of the things stylistically that are so beautiful there, I think. A pale spindle of light, a sallow oval, a clot of black shadow. Le Guin is much more in the realm of modernist writing, which is trying to use unexpected descriptive terms, rather than, say, Tolkienian writing or even Donaldson's writing by Thesaurus. Now, the rest of the book, Wizard of Earthsea, is about Ged trying to get rid of this shadow, to fight it, to run from it, whatever he can do. And I won't give away the whole plot, but I'll say that the problem at the end is that there are 2 things in the world, Ged himself and this shadow beast, that both have the same name. And that's a flaw in the structure that Le Guin set up with. Everything has to have a unique name. There are 2 things, 2 signifieds, with 1 signifier. And eventually that problem is solved and the world is healed. In the second book, The Tombs of Atuan, I'll go into the plot of that a little bit more, but just to set up this linguistic material, there's a character named Tenar, who's the one priestess of the Tombs of Atuan. These are in a barbarian land, not part of the archipelago, though they are part of islands, where they don't believe in magic, but she's the one priestess. And when she's taken from her family at an early age, they go through a ceremony where her name is taken from her, and she is then called Arha, which means the Eaten One. And so she has no real name, but the same name as all the other priestesses going back, and she's supposedly reincarnated. Ged comes to the Tombs of Atuan and has this interaction with Tenar. Ged comes to the Tombs of Atuan and has this interaction with Tenar/Arha, and he says to her, you can be Tenar or you can be Arha, but you cannot be both. In other words, she can't be one signified with 2 signifiers. It won't work. You can't have two names. You can only have one. She has to choose which one she's going to be. So it's the mirror image of that situation where Ged and his shadow both had the same name. Here it's that two names for one person, and that's solved at the end of that book. Finally, in the third book, The Farthest Shore, that linguistic system becomes even more troubled. Things don't match up with their names anymore. A wizard has cast a spell relating to death. That's another theme, and we'll go into that much more. And in so doing, he has ruptured the bond between name and thing. Now it's like our regular world, our mundane world, where signifier and signified don't have any special relationship, and the magic stops working. The magic is draining out of the world. And so Le Guin is suggesting there, you can't have two things with the same name. You can't have two names for the same thing. And either more, you can't have names that just refer to other names rather than referring to things. If they refer just to other names, we're back in our world. So each of those books is Le Guin kind of working out this physics of her magic that she's come up with. And I think that point is important in understanding Le Guin as a writer. She's actually was first known as a science fiction writer before as a fantasy writer. And some of her science fiction, The Dispossessed, The Lathe of Heaven, and particularly The Left Hand of Darkness, are seen as monuments of really good science fiction. She thinks like a science fiction writer, or maybe like an anthropologist, in that she's trying to develop the implications of the choices she's made. Once she said word's going to equal thing, well, what are the problems you could get from that? And that's how it plays out in Earthsea. I kind of skipped over The Tombs of Atuan, which in some ways is a really powerful, beautiful book, not the least because it has a female protagonist who is the priestess to these ancient tombs, a labyrinth underground, into only which she is allowed to go. Ged comes there to steal a treasure that has been lost, and he eventually frees Arha from the servitude of the tombs and brings her back. I want to focus a little bit more on The Farthest Shore, because I think this is the most challenging book in some ways of the three, and the hardest to understand. And it also has what is, in my opinion, the most beautifully written scene in fantasy literature, even more than Frodo at the Crack of Doom, and even more powerful. In The Farthest Shore, something has gone wrong with magic. Something has gone wrong with that relationship, as I talked about, between the name and the thing. And Ged, who is now the archmage of all of Earthsea, sets off on a quest with Aaron, a young prince, and they go to try to find the source of the trouble. And they end up sailing all over the archipelago. You get to see various different customs and cultures and so forth. But eventually, they end up on Celador, the furthest west island where the great dragons live, near where the great dragons live. And I want to give you another example of Le Guin's kind of beautiful writing here. This is a description of Celador once they've landed there. The dunes ran inland, low and grassy, for half a mile or so, and then there were lagoons, thick with sedge and salt reeds, and beyond those low hills lay yellow-brown and empty to the end of sight. Beautiful and desolate was Celador. Nowhere on it was there any mark of man, his work, or inhabitation. There were no beasts to be seen, and the reed-filled lakes bore no flocks of gulls or wild geese or any bird. And that kind of quiet, beautiful loneliness is a characteristic of Le Guin's writing. And also, I should take a little digression here to say it's a characteristic of fantasy writing to have really, really good writing about landscape. Fantasy might not be so good about dialogue in terms of realistic dialogue, but when people contrast realism with fantasy, fantasy does realistic description of landscape as well or better than mainstream literature. So Ged and Aaron come to Celador, and there they eventually come to the very edge of the world, and the evil wizard who's been causing all the problems comes to them, and they follow him into the land of death. And the land of death is really interestingly described. It's dark and dusty and silent and miserable. They confront the evil wizard, and they actually debate with the evil wizard and find out what he's done, which is to try to cast a spell so that he can live forever. And there's that theme again, that trying to become immortal has terrible consequences, but yet people want to do it. People are afraid of death. I think this is very natural. I also think this is why fantasy literature, and children's fantasy in particular, is so appealing, because that kind of idea of wanting immortality and trying to deal with the problem of death is not handled particularly well by mainstream literature. Mainstream literature talks about what death does to people, as I said, but it doesn't really talk about the desire for eternal life and possibly consolations to that. So, Ged and the evil wizard speak, and Ged gives his name to the evil wizard. And the evil wizard says, "Now I have your name, I can control you." And Ged says, "My name is of no use to you. You have no power over me at all. I'm a living man. My body lies on the beach of Celador, under the sun, on the turning earth. And when that body dies, I'll be here. But only in name alone, in shadow. Do you not understand? Did you never understand, you who called up so many shadows from the dead, who summoned all the hosts of the perished, even my lord Erith Akbe, wisest of us all? Did you not understand that even he is but a shadow and a name? His death did not diminish life, nor did it diminish him. He is there, not here. Here is nothing, dust and shadows. There he is the earth and sunlight and leaves of the trees, the eagle's flight. He is alive, and all who ever died live. They are reborn and have no end, nor will there ever be an end. All save you. For you would not have death. You lost death. You lost life in order to save yourself, your immortal self. What is it? Who are you? And essentially at that point, Ged has won, even though there's going to be an even better scene later on, because he has shown that this questing for eternal self-identity in Le Guin's world is wrong. And this is going to be played out much more in the 5th book, where Le Guin finally confronts this land of the dead that she's invented. But the evil wizard finally says, I opened a door between the land of death and the land of life, and I can't shut it. And all the life is draining out into this land of death, and all the magic is draining out. And Ged says, lead me there. And so him and Aaron follow the evil wizard to this hole between the worlds, which is basically a dry river, a dry spring. And Aaron sees this horrible place where a dead soul crawling into earth and darkness was born again dead. And he said, let it be shut. And Ged says it will be shut. And then, with all the skill of his life's training and with all the strength of his fierce heart, Ged strove to shut that door, to make the world whole once more. And under his voice and the command of his shaping hands, the rocks drew together painfully, trying to be whole, to meet. But at the same time, the light weakened, dying out from his hands, from his face, dying out from his yew staff, until only a little glimmer of it clung there. By that faint light, Aaron saw that the door was nearly closed. Now, I think any writer of any tradition would be enormously proud to have written that sentence with all the skill of his life's training and with all the strength of his fierce heart. And it only works. It's not a particularly brilliant sentence in and of itself, but it works with everything that has come before it that is built up to our characterization of Ged. And Ged does, at that moment, use everything to save the two worlds. And as we see later on in Tahanu, the 4th book, Ged pays a terrible price for that. The Farthest Shore is a difficult book because it is so much about death. And it's hard for kids to read, and that's why I think Le Guin was evolving from Wizard of Earthsea, from Tombs of Atuan, into a book about death. She's often said that Wizard of Earthsea was about growing up, Tombs of Atuan was about sex, and Farthest Shore was about death. And I think that that's probably a good description of the 3 books. I want to bring up one more line in The Farthest Shore before I move on to Tahanu and The Other Wind very briefly, before we move on to Robert Holdstock. And that is this line that Le Guin has Aaron, who eventually is going to become king of all Earthsea, say to Ged at one point. She says Aaron had fallen in love with Ged, and she doesn't mean, I don't think she means homosexual love here. It's homoerotic love, perhaps, but it's more just love of a young man for a great man that he sees. And Aaron says to Ged, I have given my love to what is worthy of love. Is that not the kingdom and the never-perishing spring? Now, I think that's a beautiful piece of poetry and perhaps one it carved on my own tombstone. But more importantly, that's possibly the heart of the entire Earthsea books, of giving your love to what's worthy of love. And if you've done that, then everything else falls into place because that is the kingdom and the never-perishing spring. I think Tolkien would have agreed with that. And Le Guin certainly loves and respects Tolkien, unlike many other fantasy writers who she has not much good to say about. She points out that there is a kind of love and sadness at the heart of Tolkien's work. Well, after a long interregnum between when she finished The Farthest Shore and when she wrote Tahanu at the very beginning of the 90s, Le Guin changed a great deal. She had always considered herself a feminist, but now she became a much more active, vocal, political feminist. And she became very troubled by the fact that she'd written a world in which all the wizards were boys. There wasn't any female magic, though there is a witch. In a few places there's a witch or a sorceress. But she felt she had followed her tradition, her Western tradition, and excluded women. And so in Tahanu, she decided not to try to rewrite the whole tradition because she couldn't undo her old books. She couldn't do what Tolkien did with the Gollum story and just change it in a new edition, or she didn't want to do that. And instead, she decided to consider the implications of a world in which only men had magical power. And so Tehanu comes out, like so many other books by feminist writers from the early 90s, as very, very focused on violence towards women, oppression towards women, sexual violence towards women. And I think that that definitely takes it out of the children's genre when there's a rape and when there's a child who's been thrown into a fire and horribly burned and so forth, that it's really not a pleasant book. And I will admit that when I was in college and this book came out, and I wrote a review of it, I absolutely trashed it as the worst book, and how could Le Guin sully and destroy her legacy. But being more mature and looking back at it now, I can see what she's doing in Tehanu. And actually, one of the great things she does is she takes a main character who's been hideously burned and disfigured and everyone is afraid of, and she transforms that character through the course of the book into someone that we as readers do love. Now, it's a horrible thing to think about, an intentionally burned and mutilated child. And I actually don't want to think about that when I read, and Le Guin forces me to. But what she does in the end by making you love that child and see the power in that child is really an incredible accomplishment, even though it's not really something that you expect to see in the fantasy genre. It's not really the happy ending. The other thing that Le Guin does in Tehanu, which I resented a great deal, and I think many readers do, is that she shows Ged stripped of his power, with no magic at all. He left all his magic at that dark spring when he tried to save the world. When he saved the world, I should say. But by losing all his magic, he's lost an essential part of himself. Ged has always been someone who loved the art magic, who loved doing illusions and changes, and now he can't do any of it. And we see what Ged has to deal with when he's no longer powerful. And in a sense, Le Guin emasculates him. And that's very hard for a reader to take who's grown up with Ged, who's loved Ged, who wanted to be Ged, and then to see Ged kind of cut down like this is very difficult. But I think it was essential in some ways for Le Guin to work out what happens when someone has to sacrifice everything. In that way, she's even more hard-nosed than Tolkien. Tolkien says Frodo has sacrificed everything, and tough, he doesn't get to live in the Shire. But at least he does sail away to the Blessed Land. Le Guin says, what happens when someone sacrifices everything to save the world, and the world doesn't recognize it, and the world doesn't give them any rewards, and they don't want rewards, and the one thing they want, they can't have? And I think this could apply very well to, say, a veteran of a war who really wants nothing more than to be able to walk again, or to not be burned, or to not be injured, and can't have that. And in that sense, Le Guin is dealing with very, very mature, powerful, and important themes in Tehanu, as much as I don't really like the book. But then she writes The Other Wind, and The Other Wind redeems all the suffering and all the horror of Tehanu, because Le Guin has then again reached the beauty that she achieved in The Farthest Shore. The Other Wind deals with the problem Le Guin has set up, which is a land of the dead where people's souls go, where she wants to have it in a reincarnating universe. And not to give away it, because The Other Wind is much more of a mystery than the other books, and I don't want to give away the plot. But essentially, Le Guin is teasing out this implications of where could this land of the dead come from? How could it stop reincarnation? And how could that be changed? She has a set of really appealing characters, beautiful scenes, and they go on a great journey, as is typical. And in the end, they manage to heal the world. I won't say how they do it. The Other Wind is just beautiful from one end to the other, whether it's Le Guin's talking about a character who can use his magic to heal a broken pot and how that's done, or it's even Ged who's come to accept and be happy with his situation in life, living on a farm, taking care of goats. But it is a beautiful, consoling, happy ending, the sort of thing that she sort of had at the end of The Farthest Shore, but is very much like The Lord of the Rings now, in that they do live happily ever after, even though there are many sacrifices that go into it. So I think that the Earthsea books overall are a great triumph. And Le Guin also wrote some Tales from Earthsea, which is a kind of side stories that go along with those, and those are very well done also. But The Other Wind, she finally manages to bring it to a climax, and she also manages to escape the kind of buried Christianity of her tradition, where the land of the dead and so forth, and bring it into the Buddhism and Taoism that she wanted to with reincarnation. And she gets that to work, finally, after 5 books. What's so remarkable about Le Guin, again, is how she's willing to follow the logic of the ideas she's set in place, even if she doesn't like where it goes, and how she has that kind of anthropologist rigor in describing another culture and figuring out how those cultures would work given the assumptions she'd started with. I now want to move on to Robert Holdstock, and I should admit right off the bat that this is a somewhat unusual choice. A lot of critics of fantasy would put Le Guin in the pantheon with Tolkien. Whether they would put Holdstock there is another question. And in fact, I'm not even dealing with the body of Holdstock's work. I'm just going to focus on two of his books, Mythago Wood and Levandis. But the reason I want to do this is these other works that I've been putting in the pantheon, The Lord of the Rings and Earthsea, are those completely enclosed secondary worlds. They don't touch the primary world. They're not tangent to the primary world in any meaningful sense. Holdstock, on the other hand, is very much about the interaction of the primary world with the secondary world, like C.S. Lewis in Narnia, like Donaldson in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and so forth. But Holdstock manages to get it to work in a really interesting way that actually draws on Tolkien, but is not afraid of him or in anxiety of him. The kind of locus of everything that happens in Holdstock's first two major books, Mythago Wood and Levandis, is Ryehope Wood or Shadowdox Wood. And this wood has what Holdstock calls mythopaic, however you want to pronounce it, power, taking that word from Tolkien, myth, the ability to generate myth. Holdstock's brilliant gimmick is that in these particular locations, anything that has been a myth in people's minds will become real. In other words, if there's a myth about a king who sends his two sons and daughter off into the woods, that king will appear in Ryehope Wood. And the further you go into the wood, which the wood is larger on the inside than the outside, just like the human mind, the further you go in, the more that you find. And that wood, like the human mind, is larger on the inside than the outside. Your presence as a person from the primary wood generates mythagos. Mythagos are flesh and blood creations of myths. They're characters from myths. And Holdstock does this amazing job of dealing with all the British Isles material that Tolkien left out. Tolkien's mythology is very closely tied, where it's not completely invented by him, is closely tied to medieval, specifically Anglo-Saxon and Middle English. Holdstock is going back to Druids, shamanism, the Green Man, Morris dancers, and so forth. And so he finds a whole way to bring in English prehistory, Bronze Age people running around in animal skins and shooting arrows, and giant stags with broken horns, and green men, these tree creatures that walk through the forest, and so forth. Le Guin's protagonists are anthropologists of cultures that don't exist. Tolkien's protagonists are hobbits, they're just there. Holdstock's protagonists are sort of reminiscent of the characters that you might find in 1950s science fiction in like the work of H.P. Lovecraft. Obsessed scientists who live right next to some strange, powerful place and who are obsessed with finding out about it. They're not really anthropologists, maybe more explorers, maybe more antiquarians, and they go into Ryehope Wood trying to figure out how it works, trying to find it, and then they can have things happen and like be killed by a mythological beast, which is interesting and ironic to say the least. Now, I personally find the kind of shamanistic aspects of Holdstock's work a little off-putting. There's lots of people carrying around leather pouches filled with the bones of dead people, or picking the maggoty skin off of bird skulls and collecting them, or having mortuary houses with lots of corpses in them that the one character eats the souls out of their skulls, and it's kind of creepy and disturbing. But what it has, that Tolkien's work has, that Earthsea has, is a complete integrity of vision. There's no irony in it. There's no sense that the author is using this world to tell you something or something like that. It's simply that there's an entry point into this amazing, beautiful, terrifying secondary world. And the other thing that Holdstock does that none of the other authors really do is suggest how gross medieval and prehistoric life might have been. His characters are dirty and filthy and have diseases and sores and festering wounds and so forth, and they have to hunt for their food and eat semi-raw, semi-burned deer flesh and so forth. And yes, it's yucky, but it takes us away from the kind of sanitized fantasy world that we have in Tolkien. And even in Le Guin mentions slavery, and there are some characters who suffer misery. It's pretty sanitized. They never have to really hunt very much for food and so forth. And Holdstock brings that in, which must have been a really significant portion of life in that time period, was hunting for food and having trouble with hygiene and so forth. So in that sense, it's more realistic, but it also still operates at the fantasy level and respects the fantasy level. So in that sense, it might be more realistic, though I still reject that dichotomy, but it still works fully within the fantasy genre. and it makes fantasy something that connects up with a long history of folk custom and tradition, but is free of the kind of reliance on literary texts and works that Tolkien has, and at the same time is different quantitatively and qualitatively from Le Guin's universe. So I would put Tolkien first in the pantheon and Le Guin second, and I would put Holdstock third, even though his subsequent books have not been as powerful as Mythago would, and particularly Lavandis, which I think he gets everything to work in there. There are, of course, other contemporary writers that go beyond the scope of this course, and I might mention writers like Terry Pratchett, who's more of a humor writer in fantasy, or Patricia McKillop, who definitely brings a woman's sensibility in a way somewhat different than Le Guin to her work. There's also Mercedes Lackey, and there's a whole new set of writers who are coming along. I think it's going to be very interesting in the next decade to see how writers deal with the anxiety of Tolkien now that so many other writers have come along and become models of different ways to handle this material. And I expect both Le Guin and Holdstock to exert their own anxieties on the next generation of writers. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to move into children's fantasy, which chronologically starts even before Tolkien and certainly picks up with C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, which were published even before The Lord of the Rings, though after The Hobbit. But children's fantasy has been enormously influential because of its ability to cross genres and categories. And as we'll see, it does some of the same things as adult fantasy, but it does some things very differently as well.
This ends Lecture 11.